Welcome to The Big Deal. I'm Errol Louis, national political anchor at Spectrum News. Every week since we launched this show, we've been looking at some of the biggest issues shaping our nation and the final stretch of the road to the White House. More than 63 million Americans have already cast their ballots, and in just a few days, voters will have their final say in this historic presidential election. This week, both Donald Trump and Kamala Harris delivered their closing arguments, showing a stark contrast between their candidacies. And in the final full week of the 2024 campaign, both candidates visited all 7 battleground states, from Pennsylvania all the way to Nevada, shoring up last-minute support from key voting blocs, while Trump also made stops in a few other states, including New York and New Mexico. In this final episode before election night, the big deal is how close the race has become, with Trump and Harris still neck and neck, both nationally and in the swing states. I'll break it all down with the help of my Spectrum News colleagues across the country. But first, here's a look at some of the key moments from the campaign trail.
Are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? Hispanics love Trump. No president's done more for Puerto Rico than I have.
Donald Trump has spent a decade trying to keep the American people divided and afraid of each other.
I'm president. I want to protect the women of our country. Well, I'm going to do it whether the women like it or not. I'm going to protect them.
It actually is, I think, very offensive, and this is just the latest on a series of reveals by the former president of how he thinks about women and their agency.
She's worse than crooked Hillary, actually. You know, Hillary was a lot smarter.
He is not someone who is thinking about how to make your life better.
And I will bring back the American dream.
He has increased his violent rhetoric, Donald Trump has.
I'm asking you to be excited about the future again. You have to be excited.
Put the Constitution of the United States before party.
Joining me now with some political analysis are 2 top commentators. Ybeth Bruzual is an anchor for Spectrum News 13 in Orlando, Florida. Alex Cohen is political anchor at Spectrum News 1 in Southern California. And Ybeth, there was a firestorm of reaction to those hateful and obscene insults that were directed at Latinos during Donald Trump's final rally at Madison Square Garden. Of course, it included or was followed by a wave of celebrity endorsements of Kamala Harris. So are Democrats successfully turning that painful moment into political gain?
Really, it depends on who you ask, Errol. And if you ask Democrats, they're going to say yes, and here's why. It has been an avalanche of messages to turn the situation around, not just on the mainstream media, as some parties call it, but also every single level, every platform of social media, TikTok, Instagram, X, Facebook, Threads. The campaign using powerful imagery of Puerto Rico and faces that are recognized within the Hispanic community and the Puerto Rican community to get that message across that nobody calls us trash. But I also have to add this. Watching Spanish language media in Puerto Rico all this week, they dedicated a lot of time, but then they scaled back. And there was also, and I didn't see this on any of the media, a caravan, a pro-Trump caravan in the streets of Puerto Rico with flags and signs saying, no matter what, they support Trump. Some anyway.
Very interesting. And now, Alex, this week, Donald Trump also used violent rhetoric to attack a former Congresswoman, Liz Cheney. Here's a little bit of what that sounded like.
She's a radical war hawk. Let's put her with a rifle standing there with 9 barrels shooting at her, okay? Let's see how she feels about it. You know, when the guns are trained on her face.
With threats at Donald Trump rallies going from lock her up to, basically shoot her in the face. We know from pollsters and strategists that women voters in particular don't really respond well to that kind of talk. It reminds me that we are seeing what is an enormous gender gap, with men flocking to Trump and women basically going to Kamala Harris.
And of course, that's not necessarily an absolute truth across the board. But, hearkening back to what Ybeth just said a couple moments ago, the Trump campaign said those remarks about Liz Cheney have been taken out of context. It had more to do with her record on the war than an actual threat of violence. But we live in this world of snippets and tiny little chunks of information. And I have a good feeling that a lot of the folks might just hear a small portion of that, which definitely I think will sound to a lot of folks and a lot of women like a threat of violence. When I think of the gender gap in this election, the first thing that comes to mind is an ad that's been running. Julia Roberts does the narration, and it pictures a couple going in, and the man votes and the woman votes, husband and wife, and the woman kind of looks across to another woman, and the whole, voiceover is, when you vote, it is your secret ballot. Nobody, not even your husband, needs to know who you're voting for. And I think it'll be really interesting to see, is there a strong turnout of women who've just said enough with the former president and his rhetoric when it comes to women?
Ybeth, one of the biggest policy differences in this race is that Donald Trump wants to continue allowing individual states to place tough, near absolute restrictions on abortion, while Kamala Harris has promised to reinstate the protections of Roe versus Wade. When you look at the early voting data, how is this issue playing out, as best you can tell?
I want to talk about something that we saw on Newsweek, right? And depends on the day of the week or the way the wind is blowing. Poll after poll seem to vary. But this one in particular from Newsweek, as I look down on my notes, there's at least 10-point gap in favor of women in the early vote, Pennsylvania, which is key to talk about. That's according to Politico, and they're looking at analysis from the University of Florida's United States Election Project. So women registered, right, in Pennsylvania, Democrats, also making a nearly third in early votes of people who did not vote in the 2020 election. And I want to point out to something that our colleague Alex just mentioned. Missed opportunity, because when you look at that ad, and we've seen that ad here in Florida as well, they're saying when a wife, she's looking over her shoulder at her husband. Well, what if a wife has a wife, not a husband? So I think the messaging there could have been improved depending on who you ask. It is 2024, so that really jumped out at me.
Very interesting. And now, Alex, let's talk about a state next to yours. In Nevada, both candidates are fighting hard to win. What is the state of play in that particular swing state?
Man, the Silver State is a very, very close race indeed. And it's just a place that has changed so much in recent years. We've seen a lot of folks moving into the area, and a place that was once considered a Democratic stronghold may be shifting. A lot of folks are paying a whole lot of attention to early vote. But the thing is, where Republican voters have definitely been outpacing Democrats, that said, we'll go back to your ballot is your secret ballot. Just because there is an R next to your name does not mean you voted for Donald Trump. Just because there is a D next to your name doesn't mean you voted for Kamala Harris. And a shout out to John Ralston, who is really the man to follow if you want to know what's going on in Nevada. He points out the fact that right now you've got about a quarter of the voters independent. So you can't make any assumptions whatsoever about how they're voting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, truly a 50-50 race. In our last minute, Ybeth, I see that Hillary Clinton is campaigning in Tampa this weekend. This is a place notably that Kamala Harris has not visited. Do Democrats actually think there's a long shot chance at winning Florida?
There's a chance with everything in this election cycle. But I think right now, Florida is red, all right? But there are pockets that have turned purple. And some districts in the last few cycles have flipped. So there is hope. And it's not just Secretary Clinton who's coming. Her husband, Bill Clinton, also in the state of Florida this weekend. And it's not just the top of the ticket. They're looking down the ballot. Senate race in Florida, really intense right now. The incumbent Senator Rick Scott, Republican, being challenged by Debbie Mucarsel-Powell, a Democrat, who some of the polls have them neck and neck.
Okay, tough to predict. But we'll be watching all of it. Thank you both so much for that analysis. We're going to take a break now. Coming up, we've got more analysis on the race for president. Stay with us. We're back with The Big Deal, keeping our focus on the high-stakes race for president. Alex Cohen is still with us, joining us from Southern California. And Tim Boyum is now with us. He's a political anchor for Spectrum News 1 in Raleigh, North Carolina, one of the 7 battleground states that everyone is watching especially closely. And Tim, early voting in North Carolina has broken records. Why is that happening? And as far as you can tell, does it favor either party?
Yeah, so by the end of today, half of all registered voters in North Carolina will have already voted. Just astounding numbers. We've been breaking records. Part of it is because we are simply a fast-growing state, and so there's more and more voters that are coming out. But also, Republicans have been given sort of permission to do early voting. In the past, Donald Trump has told them to vote on Election Day. Well, now we're seeing more encouragement, not only from Donald Trump, but the Republican Party and the RNC to vote early. Because of that, Republicans are right there neck and neck with Democrats. But the one thing, the caveat about that is we don't know whether they're just displacing the Election Day vote or whether or not that means that they are beating out Democrats. And so it's actually creating a lot of confusion to try to read the tea leaves of what's going to happen. But it's gangbusters. We're going to break records easily.
Okay, that in itself is good news. Now, when it comes to the mechanics of vote counting, every state does it differently. As far as I can remember, doesn't North Carolina tend to spit out numbers relatively early in the evening on Election Day?
Relatively, yes. It used to be more. There's a law change that happened. So we used to be one of the states where they would be able to tabulate early voting before 7:30, where the polls close in North Carolina. They could release them right at 7:30. That law has now changed. And so they cannot start tabulating until after 7:30 on Tuesday night. We will get absentee mail-in ballot results starting around 7:30. And then sometime between 8 and 9:30 is when we're going to get those early voting results. And then the county ones will start coming in after that. Just as a sort of final stat on that, about 12:44 a.m. is when the final votes were uploaded in 2020. We'll see if they can get that done earlier this time. Okay, I don't know if that'll happen or not.
It's going to be a late night for all of us, no matter what. And you know, finally, Tim, you have reported on the extraordinary efforts to set up early vote facilities in the western part of the state, where recent storms devastated Asheville and about 10 different counties out there. How is that working out?
Yeah, just real quick, it's inspirational in a lot of ways. I met a woman at an early voting site. She lost everything and was still determined to go out and vote. So that was really inspirational. What we've been told is that early voting numbers are somewhat similar to 2020, which is good news in some ways because they're still coming out in big numbers, but everywhere else it's growing from 2020. So that seems to tell us that it's going to be a little bit lower. That's good news and bad news for both Republicans and Democrats, because Asheville is a huge Democratic area, but all the rural areas around it are Republican. So it's going to be something to watch on election night.
Okay, so now Alex, on the other hand, California always seem to take days or even weeks before we get the final count. What is that all about? Are we going to be up all night waiting for those numbers?
Oh, I would say go to bed early because it's going to take days, Errol, for some of these races, especially these close congressional races. Look, here's the thing. It is very important to the good folks of California who run the elections process to make sure that as many people who are eligible to can vote. So that means, for example, let's say you decide to mail your ballot on Election Day. They want to make sure that it gets received. So we have these rather large windows. And so sometimes you're waiting and waiting and waiting because sometimes you just got to make sure, are there any last minute ballots coming in? If they make it by that deadline, then those too get counted. Double checking that signatures are okay. I've talked to, registrars here in California who feel the pain because they know everyone is wanting to know results right away in our fast-paced information world, but they said, you can get it done quickly or you can get it done accurately. And in the end, that accuracy, I think, is what should be, and certainly is to these folks who work in elections, the most important priority.
Okay, well, when I want to know the totals, I will be checking you out on Spectrum News 1. So now, Tim, walk us through what you think is the simplest or most likely path to victory for both candidates.
Yeah, so there's a lot of puzzle pieces that can move around, but we know basically the states that they're going to win and the states that they need to win. And we can show you here for Kamala Harris, this is what I think is, coming up to sort of a northern strategy versus southern strategy. And for Kamala Harris, I think you look at that blue wall, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, and then that electoral college vote. in Nebraska. That's most likely, I think, possibly the easiest policy for her to get all those votes up there. For Donald Trump, it's sort of that southern strategy. It's winning Georgia, North Carolina, and then also adding in, obviously, the all-important state of Pennsylvania. Some people have North Carolina in there for Harris, too, as a possible path, but Democrats have only won in 2008, 1976 in the modern era before that. So I think she needs to focus more up north. But it sure seems at this point that Pennsylvania, if there's a ground zero in this election, it is that state.
Absolutely. Alex, your turn. What do you think Harris and Trump need to do in these final days?
They need to get people out and voting. Look, I think there's very few people left in this country. There's no one who feels meh about it. There's no one who doesn't have strong opinions. But are those opinions strong enough to get out and actually vote? I think there might be a lot of people who just feel so turned off by both candidates or feel very strongly about one of them, but maybe not strong enough to turn out for the other one. I think that's going to be the real clincher in the end, is what actually happens on that day. A lot of people will wake up with that individual choice of whether or not they're going to take the effort to go out and vote. And I think there could be some surprises that none of us could possibly pretend at this moment. It may take some time to see what those surprises have been.
And real quick, Alex, we spoke last week about all of the competitive swing congressional districts in and around Los Angeles in particular. Do the Democrats get a boost because they've got a favorite daughter, Kamala Harris, at the top of the ticket?
I think a lot of folks here in California can put a distance between who they vote at the top of the ticket. Local isn't necessarily always everything that there is about politics. And I think we could see some interesting split tickets here in the Golden State.
All right. Thanks very much, Alex. And thank you, Tim. We are not done with the big deal just yet. Coming up next, we'll examine how democracy has shaped the race for the White House. Stay with Spectrum. Thank you for watching our YouTube channel. Let Spectrum News be your resource for balanced, in-depth political coverage, and click the subscribe button right here. You can also download our app or watch us on TV to learn more about the candidates, where they stand on the issues, and more. We'll see you then.